Yeah, g'day everyone and welcome to episode number 42 of the Australian Rock Show. My name is Dennis Gray from the Rockin' and Rollin' Gray Brothers. Today is Saturday the 10th of October 2015 when this show is being recorded. Back in 1980, TMG, aka the Ted Mulry Gang, cut the album Locked In, one of their most underrated records. It was also the year that the film Roadie hit cinemas around the world. The accompanying catchphrase for that movie was, "Bands make it rock, roadies make it roll." Those words kept coming back to me whilst reading the new book by Ronald Clayton titled It's a Roadie's Job, a guy who for years devoted his entire life pretty much to TMG. If Ted, Herm, Les and Gary made it rock, then Ron sure as hell made it roll. This book is essential for anyone who is a disciple of Australian music, and I thought we should get Ron on the show to talk more about it. It's an interview recorded a couple of days back, Thursday the 8th of October, which we will hear in a moment. But before we do, as we often do, let's get in the mood with a song. From 1990, here are TMG with the rollicking Old Habits. Ron, welcome to the Australian Rock Show.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis.
So great to have you on the show. Firstly, mate, congratulations on the publication of your book, It's a Roadie's Job. Can I say that as a fan of both TMG and Australian rock and roll, I enjoyed it immensely, and it's essentially your amazing life story, one which has been heavily involved in the Australian music scene, but essentially TMG. What has the reaction for the book been like so far?
Well, you know, I haven't had a lot of publicity on it because I had to self-publish. But most of those who have read it have been very positive. So I'm exceptionally glad or happy from that kind of response. And I never anticipated selling much more than a couple of hundred anyway. So I would say pretty good. Jump in My Car only sold 3 copies in 1 week and it went to number 1.
Exactly.
I sold 106 copies in 2 weeks, so I feel pretty good.
Well, mate, we've got a bit of territory to get through tonight, but before we do, I have to let you know that we start each show with a notable song, and on this particular show we kicked off with a TMG tune from 1990 titled Old Habits, written by Ted Mulry and Les Hall. It's one of my favourite TMG songs, and one which, after reading your book, you name as the best record TMG released. What is it about that tune which does it for you?
The production of it was a lot better than a lot of their earlier stuff, but the song itself lyrically epitomised the life of the band. And I just think that, it was a pity that it came out at a time when they were no longer acceptable. But to me, it's a great song. I mean, my other favourite song, of course, was Wanted Man, which I think would have been a hit all around the world, but it just didn't get that production because it was done during that period of time when we were just on the road constantly, and they had to try and fit things in 8 days in the studio, so... but yeah, Old Habits I think is exceptional. It was originally not going to be a TMG single. It was just a collaboration between Les and Ted, but it ended up being a band single anyway.
I bought that on 7-inch back in 1990 from memory, not long before they phased vinyl out in this country. But I don't want to get off track. So, obvious question, mate. What was your main reason in writing a book like this?
I've got huge amounts of memorabilia, but I was, I had gone through, and am still going through a really bad divorce, really nasty. I was suffering a lot of depression with my low self-esteem, and the people said to me, you need to concentrate on the positives, and you need to sit down and you've got to write out the list of things you've done, things you wanted to do or haven't done, and list the positives against the negatives. And when I started doing it, it just flowed into a book.
Mate, let's go back a bit. So you were born and raised in Newcastle, correct?
Yes.
Okay, from your book, I learned that you grew up...
Some people don't think I was raised too well, but...
From your book, I learned that you grew up idolising John Lennon. What was it about Lennon that you identified with?
The Beatles was my first... It's what got me interested in music, like probably most people of my generation and most people who went on to play in bands. I just think that, John Lennon always seemed to buck the system. He was always anti-establishment and And I I think, even up to his death, nothing changed. And I really liked that. And plus he was, he really had good in-depth songs. They weren't songs that were just written for the sake of having a hit record or something. He always, his songs had a lot of meaning. The world really misses somebody like that.
And I guess you would have appreciated his wit. Well, yeah,
I do appreciate his wit. I have several of his earlier books and stuff. All the Beatles together. And then, I remember Herman and I in the Velvet Underground days, and it was actually before that, but we went to every session when Help came out, and I didn't actually know Herman then, but it was only on for 14 sessions over a week in Newcastle. We were there at every one of them, and the same thing when Hard Day's Night, and but yeah, I like the Beatles. I like the English humour.
Can I get you to tell me about two of your first concerts, the Easy Beats and also the Masters Apprentices? What kind of impact, if any, did those two shows have on you?
Well, I had already seen the Beatles at Sydney Stadium by this point. I was only 13. I hadn't even turned 14 when I saw the Beatles, and that was a turning point in my life. When I saw the Easy Beats at Surf City in Newcastle, the hysteria and everything was very Beatlesque, but the band themselves, I thought, were just like another British band. They had that British sound. They all had English accents. I was impressed by them, but the Masters Apprentices, they just blew me away. When I saw the Masters Apprentices and they had Buried and Dead, and they were doing that really, they got into that heavy Kingfish overtones, and as I say in my book, I believe, everybody says that AC/DC is the epitome of the Australian sound, but I think it started with the Masters Apprentices and it just got better and better.
And I should point out that Newcastle was such a fertile place for rock and roll back then. So many great bands came out of that region, including early 60s outfit the Vibratones, who would later become the Aztecs. I reckon you could write a fairly exhaustive book on just the Newcastle scene, mate.
Well, I probably could have. I could have dwelled on some of those things, but we had a record shop in Newcastle who run like Eagles and all the rest of those palings and that who were top 40 shops. This shop didn't deal in top 40. It was all, they'd be pushing on you the Paul Butterfield Blues Band and John Mayall, and I got into a lot of really bluesy stuff. And then by 1968, we had a disco start up in Newcastle called Bus Stop, and they played all of the same kind of things. And what happened with Newcastle was that it was really hard. A band like the Valentines, even with Bon Scott out the front, they just couldn't cut it in Newcastle because they were poncy, Whereas Ross Wilson would come to town with Sons of Vegetal Mothers and they'd slay the place. But they couldn't get a gig in lots of other places, Newcastle went on to continue to be one of the hardest towns in Australia to crack it with a band. You really had to play pub rock. So I just think it was, back then. But yeah, it's a great place, and in the 60s we were the little sister to all the capital cities, so it was that little bit harder. But I think there's some great bands and people came out of Newcastle.
One thing I love about your book is that you can accurately name dates and exact places. Did you keep a diary during your working life?
Well, I never really kept a diary, but I do have the advantage of having nearly all of the gigs that TMG and Velvet Underground ever did listed, either from worksheets and touring sheets and all of that sort of stuff. So I have that advantage, but those dates can give me, I can look at a date and I can still visually remember, visually see the entrance into the building, the stage, and certain things, but I never really kept a diary.
I don't want to spoil all of the stories contained in your book. If listeners want to learn about them, and trust me, folks, there are many, they'll have to purchase a copy. However, for our interview, I have selected just a few of your amazing stories, which I'd like you to share, starting with the late 60s Newcastle outfit Velvet Underground. you started roadieing for them in '68, correct?
Yes.
Any original material in their set back then, or was it mostly small faces?
Back then they were, that part in the 60s, everybody was keyboard orientated. Now, Velvet Underground were doing a lot of, they were right into, particularly after Les joined the band, which was earlier, '68, but they were right into doing Doors and Small Faces, a lot of that stuff that was influential to me, but they were just a really visually exciting band. They didn't do any original material, not until much later. And
you just spoke about Les. The first time you saw Les was with a local band called The Upset in a Battle of the Bands competition.
Yeah.
Was his guitar talent evident even at that early stage?
Well, not greatly. You know, he was into his guitar heroes at that point in time were Terry Britton from the Twilights and George Harrison from the Beatles, and both of them had a country gentleman, a Gresh country gentleman. And as I point out in the book, like the first time I saw Les, and Les is not a very big person in height. He was like the shortest in the band, but which is why he wore the big platform shoes to bring him up a bit. But the first time I saw him, his guitar was as big as he was.
Right.
You know, it was kind of rather strange.
Now, Velvet Underground moved from Newcastle to Sydney's Northern Beaches, also home to TMG, and I guess that's another reason why I enjoyed your book so much, having been born and raised in that area. And the book took on more of a personal feel for me, a feeling of familiarity with the suburbs you were writing about, suburbs where Velvet Underground and later TMG lived and worked in. One story of mine you'll find interesting, Ron, is that in the mid-'70s, I recall the TMG band truck was often parked, I think it was on South Creek Road at Dee Why, and when we would drive past it, my older sisters would shriek in excitement at seeing it, which for me, they're great memories.
Yeah. It was actually parked just off Fisher Road where I was living.
Okay, yep, that's it, Fisher Road.
Yeah, before it got to South Creek Road, so I was one street back from South Creek Road. You know, it caused a lot of problems, actually.
Now, I also learnt from your book that Dal Miles, the guy who would later read the TV news on Sydney's Channel 10, actually handled bookings for both Velvet Underground and Ted Mulry and the gang.
He was actually Ted Mulry's first manager.
Huh. Wow, I didn't know that.
They ran a booking agency in Brookvale, just near where the Oval is, right on the middle of the main street. But yeah, him and his wife and another guy called Bob Gunn, who used to be the lead singer of a band called Gunn or Melissa. That's
interesting. Okay, and his office was right on Pittwater Road there.
Yeah.
Interesting. If you don't mind, I want to talk a little bit about Malcolm Young. In 1971, Malcolm joined Velvet Underground. How long was his stay in the band?
Just over 12 months.
Okay, so it was a year.
He was in the band for, he's probably more than a year. He joined in January 71, and he left about April 72.
Is there any recorded material in the vaults during Mal's time with Velvet Underground? Because you mentioned that some tracks were recorded at Mona Vale on reel-to-reel.
Yes. Herman actually still has them. What happened was because everybody kept saying that not Flash in the Pan, the Marcus Hook Roll Band was the first time that Malcolm Young was ever recorded. Well, you know, we know that he was recorded a year before that in our garage in Mona Vale, but the songs never got released. We did do a session at United Sound with Spencer Lee, and they recorded that Free song, All Right Now.
What? That's Malcolm with the Velvet Underground?
Yeah, with Velvet Underground, but it was never released either because that was when that song got banned from Australian radio because of the English accent. It's got a line in it, fogging up my eyes, and the censors thought it was something else. So the song wasn't allowed to be played on radio, so we took advantage of it since it was such a great song, but then it ended up getting played anyway.
And you'd often visit the young residents in Burwood to collect and drop off Mal. Would you ever hear Angus jamming away in his room?
Not actually jamming, not electronically, but he used to be into, I mentioned in my book about, but it's kind of written in a joke, but he was into Mountain, a band called Mountain. And at that point in time, Leslie West was his favourite guitar player, but Leslie West his fingers were the size of a normal person's hand. and his guitar was specially built. But yeah, Angus really liked Leslie Weston Mountain. But I think he was already progressing as a pretty good guitar player. But you never ever got to talk much to Angus. He wasn't really a really friendly person back then.
What about?
You can't blame Angus for that because he grew up through the days of his brother George with the Easy Beats. You know, he used to jump the back fence and climb over roofs of neighbours' houses just so he could get home. So I suppose anybody intruding on his patch was not seen to be too good.
You know, Ron, there's immense interest in AC/DC nowadays, and there is a passage in your book which I wish to read because it's significant, and I am quoting you. I believe the world should congratulate Les Hall for his contribution to what became the sound of a generation. On his first rehearsal as the new member in Velvet Underground, Malcolm Young only had a little amplifier and his Gretsch guitar, but when he plugged into the 100-watt Marshall owned by Les, it opened up a brand new world of sound. The next week, he went with Les and purchased a Marshall, and so a love affair with the sound of the Gretsch and the Marshall amplifier commenced, which never ended. I wholeheartedly agree with you. Les Hall does deserve more than a nod of recognition for doing that.
It's hard. It's hard. I mean, Les deserves recognition for a lot of reasons. You know, I mean, he's a grossly underrated guitar player. He had an excellent ear. You know, he could hear a song and he knew what key it was in, and he'd never ever have to listen to the record, but he could play the thing off by heart. But yeah, he always was really good at picking sound. But yeah, because you know, I mean, Les had he of course had the Gretsch Country Gentleman, but he didn't have a little Gretsch, not like what Malcolm did. When Malcolm come over with the Firebird, you know, and then it was, you know, we had a couple of rehearsals, and the first gig we did, I think, with him was at the Kangaroo Hall in Manly. And, you know, Malcolm just didn't cut it live with Malcolm's little amp, and the next week they were gone, they went and got it, and Malcolm's used that combination ever since.
Wow, it's a great story.
You know, Les upgraded to Ampeg along the way, but that was more to suit his change to an Ampeg guitar, I think. But
now, you obviously spent large amounts of time with Malcolm Young in 71, 72. Was there any inkling you saw that made you think this guy's going to make it and make it very, very big?
Well, there wasn't any inkling that he was going to make it and make it big. I mean, you just played, and most of the time you only played on the weekend dance circuit unless you could get a residency in a club or you did school dances because there wasn't anything else happening. But he was always aiming for the top. You know, he constantly would say, you know, like, no point getting to the top in Australia because you get to the top in Australia, you're still only on the bottom somewhere else. You might as well go somewhere else and start at the bottom there because you're already on the top in Australia. You know, that was his constant attitude, and you know, that was what drove him, I think, and good luck to him. You know, he did really well, but you know, I remember a time I didn't state this in my book, but I had a Badfinger's very first LP, Magic Christian, and it had a song on it called Dear Angie, which is just strums on guitars, but it had all these little fills in between, and you know, Malcolm was really taken by that, and because it was those little things that filled all the gaps up, and that's why he liked Mark Bolan so much. But you know, we had a lot of conflict in the band because Herman hated Mark Bolan.
So in June of 72, Malcolm leaves Velvet Underground. They were called Pony at that stage, and Dave Evans joins as vocalist. Were Evans and Young ever in the lineup at the same time?
No, Malcolm had already left by the time we got Dave. We had to sing after Andy. Andy used to be in Elm Tree. He left first, and we got a guy called Brian Johnson, believe it or not. He was in the band with Malcolm, not the same Brian Johnson, but it's just ironic that you've got a Brian Johnson and Malcolm Young both in Velvet Underground at the same time.
It's uncanny, isn't it? So did Dave Evans ever perform live with Pony or Velvet Underground, or just rehearse?
We changed it. Malcolm never liked the Velvet Underground name because it was, you know, like in the first instance, it was the original singer who came up with the Velvet Underground, and we assumed that it was taken off a book called a book just called Velvet Underground, as opposed to the one in America where the band wasn't really a band. The Velvet Underground in America was a nightclub, and all these guys used to just get up and play and do jam sessions, and it ultimately became a band. So Malcolm was never comfortable with the fact that there's this Velvet Underground and there's that Velvet Underground. So we had sort of dropped the underground part off it, which had connotations musically anyway. And we're working as Velvet for a while. And then when Free came out with that song called Ride on Pony, they changed the name to Pony. That was probably for a couple of months. But then after, when David Evans came back in, we'd gone back to using the Velvet Underground name. And Dave was only in the band for about 2 months before it actually, things just sort of fell away.
Okay, but they did perform live with Dave?
Yes.
Okay. And you've obviously spent time with Dave now and again, chiefly, I guess, during the TMG Stepping Out tour across Australia some years later when Dave and Rabbit had the tour support. Did you ever see Dave fronting AC/DC?
Did I see him fronting AC/DC? Oh, yeah, in the really early days in Checkers I saw him. They didn't have... Phil Rudd wasn't with them then. I think they might have... I'm not sure who they had live. I think they had Denny Burgess. But, our paths would cross. We used to do... there was a really big school circuit in those days, and you'd be doing 4 gigs a day, and I'd be carting our gear in when AC/DC's carting theirs out, or the next school would be the opposite way around, and we bumped into each other a lot, but never spent much time, other than the first time we went to Melbourne, and we were stuck in the same accommodation quarters as them.
Well, before we move away from AC/DC, I love the story in your book where you mentioned that around 83, 84, Malcolm shows up at a Caringbah Inn gig and was jokingly heckling TMG, wasn't he? Saying stuff like, play something decent, AC/DC rules. That's pretty funny.
Well, it's what was the funny part about it is that nobody there even knew who he was. I mean, he was dressed the same as he is on stage, in his jeans and a little black singlet, which is how he always dressed in Velvet Underground. And he just wandered across the front of the stage, playing some AC/DC, man. And nobody in the place even knew who he was. I thought that was the good part.
Okay, what were your very first impressions of meeting Ted Mulry?
He was drinking tea that I'd paid for. Look, I didn't take... I had met Ted a couple of times before because we'd done shows at the Trocadero, and he was basically being backed by Elmtree in the really early days because him and John Young, they all lived out in the same area, and Ted co-wrote Elmtree's first single, so it was only in passing. It was only, my first impression of him was that he was pretty funny, and ultimately he was really good to get on with.
Well, I learnt so much about TMG from your book. So many stories written from inside the workings of the band. For example, early on the band played on quite a few cruise liners, didn't they? I never knew that. Yeah,
we did. We did the first one. Well, they were booked on a cruise. I mean, lots of bands did cruises around that time. We were booked on one for 10 days just around the Pacific, but I went on the first one because at the point they were booked, they were a 4-piece band. Steve Hart was still playing bass. They had, Ted had tried to get another bass player, and we had hoped to take Chris Bailey, but because Chris didn't go, Ted was stuck playing bass. But because we had everything was geared up for 4 people, so I went on that cruise. But on that cruise, we carted the gear because on them cruise ships, the only people who would get to see the band are the paying customers or the people who actually worked in the bar areas. None of the crew would ever get to see the band. So on many occasions when the ship was in port and everybody, we didn't have to play the lunchtime session, for instance, because everybody was ashore, we would cart the gear down 20 flights down into the under the ocean. And set up and play for the crew, and they absolutely loved the band. And we did a whole heap of cruises, and then at the end of that year, we actually even played their Christmas party on the Ocean Monarch before it went back to England for refitting.
And you just mentioned, not many people know that you just mentioned Chris Bailey from the Angels. He actually played bass a couple of times, didn't he? A gig on a pontoon at Kirribilli.
Yeah, there was a 2UW concert at Kirribilli for the opening of the Opera House in 1973, and that was only a couple of days before we went to we did the Pacific Cruise. But he also got up and played a full set out at Auburn Soccer Club the night before or a couple of nights earlier. But yeah, but we had known Chris from the days ahead band. He wasn't in the Angels at this point, but he didn't want to join the band because he'd already made a commitment to take over from Doc on bass. Okay,
in the Keystone Angels.
Yeah.
These are
were
wonderful.
Actually still called the Keystone Angels at that point, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. These are wonderful stories. I'm enjoying them. So, actually, there's one story which you've written, which I know journalist Steve Mascord will enjoy. June of 1973 at Brookvale Oval, the band played between reserve and first grade of a rugby league match. After they finished the set, and I guess they also needed to perform at half-time, Ted leans his bass against an amp and walks off. Manly fullback Graham Eadie kicks off. The ball hits Ted's bass, snaps the head off, and you've got 40 minutes to race off and find a replacement. That's a crazy story.
Yeah, well, it's even crazier if you've been to Brookvale Oval and know how hard it is to get out on a day when it's absolutely packed, and particularly on this year, I think Manly were premiers. You know, they'd had the big grand final the year before, so they were really right up the top. So, you know, it wasn't an easy feat, but I managed to do it, and I still don't know how. Excellent.
The band originally had you as an equal member, and in 1975, I believe you were earning 20% of the band's take. That in itself is an incredible situation, which seldom happens in the world of rock, does it?
No.
However,
you know, other bands, other road crews have been treated as you know, I know in the really early days, Norm Sweeney was like an equal member with Billy Thorpe for the Aztecs, but as to whether he got paid an equal share, mind you, I only got an equal share of live performances, but at this point in time, the band weren't recording. You know, that they didn't have the records out. Yeah, but that was Ted's suggestion. You know, like when the band formed up and we all moved into the house together in DY, Ted just said, you know, like, you know, we can't function, you know, band can't function without you, and I at that point was, because we weren't getting a lot of work and I had a day job, so I was paying the rent and I was paying the travel costs on the bus, and I owned the bus, and you know, so when it kicked off, he just said, you know, everything will just split equal. And so in those early days, it was just between the four of us, so it was 25%. And like I said in the book, when Gary joined, me and Herman weren't too happy because we lost 5% each.
Mate, let's take a break with a song, and I'm going to air one of my favourite tunes titled I'm Free. Man, oh man, I just love Les's searing lead guitar on I'm Free. What an underrated guitar player, which you mentioned. I think he is rock solid, a guy who never gets the accolades when people talk great Australian guitarist, but in my opinion, he's way up there. Sorry, mate, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I'm sure you'll more than agree with me on my thoughts on
definitely.
Les there.
I think he's extremely underrated as a guitar player. And I mean, you know, it goes to without saying the whole band is underrated as to their
ability and musicianship.
Yeah, and what they actually did in the industry. You know, I think they did a lot of things that nobody else has done since. But yeah, very underrated as musicians.
Okay, let's crank I'm Free, written by Ted and Les Hall, issued on the Alberts label, released on the Strutton LP. Actually, mate, when it comes to TMG, you are indeed the teacher and I'm the student. Why don't you intro I'm Free with some background info for our listeners, please?
This is TMG with I'm Free. This was a mainstay song right through to the end. It's very similar to an earlier track that Ted had written and was recorded by Alison McCallum called Take Me Back.
TMG with the track I'm Free. Tonight we're chatting to Ron Clayton, a.k.a. Ronnie Roadie, without a doubt the fifth member of TMG, about his just published book titled It's a Roadie's Job. By the way, where was the cover photo taken? And I should explain to listeners that it is a black and white photograph looking into the back of the parked band truck, gear scattered everywhere, and I guess about 7 guys, band members and road crew in a huddle?
Yeah, it was taken at Curl Youth Club near Brookvale there.
Before a show?
No, we had done. We were doing rehearsals for the Disturbing the Peace tour in 1978. So there was us and Rabbit. We were doing it was rehearsals all around. It was to get the stages. You had to rehearse to be able to fit the 2 lots of gear on a stage, and then you had to try to get it all into the truck. So it was rehearsals for the road crew and for the band. But yeah, that's where the photos were taken, and some of the photos from that session are on the back of the Disturbing the Peace LP.
Okay. Mate, through your stories, you've shed light on so many things about TMG. For example, I'd always wondered why the song Crazy never entered the top 10. I mean, the band had massive momentum at the time of release. But as I learnt from your book, Albert's had actually allowed EMI to include it on the Explosive Hits 76 album. And what family in this country back then didn't own that thing? But because of its inclusion on that compilation, the single stalled and fell down the charts. That's what a blunder that was.
Yeah, but that happened on a couple of occasions. I mean, it was hard enough to get... Jumping My Car was a battle to get it released anyway. It took months and months and months of trying to convince the record company, but one day Ted just had to go and tell the people downstairs that the boss upstairs had said he wants it out next week, so it happened. But, it was really bad in regards to Crazy. I mean, like I said, it got to number 11 after 3 weeks of release, and that was, it ended the charts the first week it came out. And to go up to number 11, and that was right across the country. And then it just stopped because everybody went and bought people were going to say, oh, why would I want to buy the single when I can buy the cheap one? And I mean, it was already, the Strutting album wasn't out at that point in time, so it's not like you could have got it on an LP.
So actually, I found it intriguing to read that the band at one time were considering recording He's Gonna Step on You Again by John Congus.
Yeah.
I think Ted's voice would have really suited that song.
Yeah. Yeah, they did. They did rough demos of it in the studio, but then they, as I pointed out, they decided to go with Sha-La-La-La Lee because it was more, because TMG were like a good time party band. It had more of that good time party atmosphere, and like Ted could clown it up a bit. But yeah, it's unfortunate that a couple of years later that the Party Boys went and did that and took it to number 1. But, obviously it was the right choice of song, but and Sha-La-La-La Lee didn't do all that good either because it was a double A side with Naturally and the eastern states picked Naturally and the western states picked Sha-La-La-La Lee, so neither of them went very high up the charts because of the split sales.
One word which comes to mind when reading about the endless touring in your book is grueling. I mean, it was such a different era back then, and I don't think kids today realise just how hard touring bands worked back in the 70s and 80s.
Mate.
I mean, in 1978, the band played Alice Springs, Mount Isa, Cairns, Tennant Creek, and on that Disturbing the Peace tour, I think you even played Carnarvon, Darwin,
yep.
and in Port Hedland, you pulled 4,000 kids, which is incredible.
No, nobody had ever, nobody had been there. I mean, we did Catherine, we did Wyndham, we did Derby. And you got to remember that there was no roads. All it was mud. The road finished at Port Hedland, but it was the same. It wasn't much different anywhere. You used to, you couldn't in the early days. You couldn't travel virtually interstate because the roads. Once you got outside the capital city, there was hardly any roads, and you took your life in your hands to travel. But you just had to do it.
Well, that's interesting. A point you just mentioned there. Many of those kids had never seen a live band. Now, I'm going to talk about the ARIA thing a bit later, but one of the criteria for that to get inducted into that Hall of Fame was to have had a cultural impact.
Yes.
Now, you've just mentioned that the band played in so many of those, at that time, remote towns, and it was kids' first experience of rock and roll. So.
Yeah.
That ticks that box nicely. But actually drawing a big crowd like that in Port Hedland, I guess that was the power and influence of Countdown then, wasn't it?
That's
being
right.
beamed into those remote towns.
The only programs, the only stations they got was the ABC.
Right.
So they had seen all of these bands on Countdown, but never ever seen any of them live. I mean, because our tour at that point was so successful, Sherbet went a couple of months later, and then it kind of everybody, I mean, but these days, like Broome is like the Gold Coast, and then it was just a little fishing village.
It's a different time nowadays, isn't it?
I mean, the other thing with TMG was, and I pointed out in the book, particularly in regards to Alice Springs, was that, when you did a lot of those places, Aboriginals weren't allowed in. And we used to go out of our way to put on shows for the Indigenous people in a lot of those towns to make sure that they were all part of it. And, I mean, that in itself the band deserves credit for, but, other bands like Midnight Oil and all these bands that, they get the credit for doing all the things when Ted Mulry Gang had already done that years earlier.
Mate, you also ran the TMG fan club with your then wife Beverly. At its peak, how many members had signed up to the TMG fan club?
About 8,500. I think we had outstripped Sherbet by this point.
Wow.
But yeah, it was difficult because she was running the fan club and I was never home. And of course, one year like 1976, I think I saw Beverly about 8 days in a whole year.
I found one comment on your book intriguing, that many people would expect you to have seen the cream of Australian rock and roll in the 70s, but of course you're busy lugging gear, so you in fact didn't see as many bands as one might think.
Yeah, no, I missed a lot of bands. Unfortunately, like I said, in 1976, I had about 8 days off. Now, we had more days than that off, but the band recorded 2 LPs, don't forget, one at the start of the year and then one in the middle of the year. We worked constantly, so unless a band was working on the same show as us, I wouldn't see them at all. And for those couple of years that we didn't get a time to get out and socialise and things, or I certainly didn't. So it was difficult. There's a lot of bands I didn't see live. There are others, and people say to me, you saw all these bands, but you've got no photos, you've got no autographs, you've got no nothing. But, it was just a job to me.
Actually, you just mentioned 2 albums in 1 year. That's an incredible feat when you think of, a lot of the bands nowadays and in recent years, it'll take them such a long time to put out an album, and TMG put 2 out in the 1 year. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's why if the Steppin' Out album is nowhere near as good a quality, the songs are good quality, but the production and everything is let down a lot because they couldn't put the time in on it. And all those songs were written on the road with, I think one of them was left over from the Struttin' LP, and the rest of them were written on the road on the Sherbet 80 Days tour, like in motel rooms, and because there was no, they didn't get times to rehearse them electronically because, the sound checks for TMG on that tour wasn't very big by comparison to Sherbet, so they were all sort of, I have the original lyrics to Lady that's on the back of a motel, a writing sheet from a motel in Mount Isa. Really?
So you'd often see Ted and Les, jotting down lyrics, driving or in motel rooms?
Yeah, they were always coming up with things. So, like, even when they were in the car, things would be going around in their head, and a lot of it didn't come together till they actually went into the studio.
Okay. Look, let's quickly take a look at 1980, and once again, I'm going to quote from your book, which states, TMG had been to hell and back, and in 1974 and 1975, they had virtually been kings of the Sydney pub and club circuit. Then, with Jump in My Car being a hit and the subsequent appearances on Countdown, the band had been transformed into a pop group with a predominantly young female audience and lost the male-dominated pub crowd. Now, it was like starting all over again to regain credibility of once again being a guitar-driven rock band. Can you recall what Mushroom did by way of promotion for that locked-in album? Because you said that TMG decided to sit out the remainder of their contract with Mushroom Records.
Well, I don't recall. What I do know is that, Mushroom promised that there'd be blanket promotion and this, that and the other. and I don't believe it. Like the LP itself only sold a couple of hundred copies, so there can't have been too much promotion. None of the singles got played on the radio. And there was 3 really excellent singles off the LP, and it's a great LP. And I don't know, but they did go in. They recorded another LP after that, and I have all of that. It's got 16 songs, right, that were recorded after that, but never ever was released.
Huh? Original songs?
Oh yeah, all original songs. Some of the best stuff they ever did. And
really, so what year is this, Ron?
1982.
Okay, so they would have had no contract.
No,
at that stage
were.
Of Mushroom?
John Fairfax and Son was starting up a record company called Sun Records, and they were going to sign up to. So they had basically signed because by 1982, the 5-year deal with Mushroom was over. So they were recording for Sun Records, but then John Fairfax decided not to go ahead. But in compensation, they did the 18 Greatest Hits one, the backtracks. So they put out the backtracks, and they re-enhanced a lot of the tracks off it, and they put that out as compensation. But the other tracks are exceptional. I mean, 2 of them tracks off that unreleased LP did actually make it onto Reunion. Rock and Roll and Shake It Up, I think it is.
Hopefully one day that could see the light of day in some form.
Well, it would be good. I mean, I've got it, and I have played it to people when we've had TMG days. I have played some of the material, and a lot of it's got Les and Gary singing. There's 3 tracks where Les is actually singing lead.
Before we finish up, I have to tell you that my all-time favourite track is Heart of Stone.
Yeah.
And I played that when I interviewed Steve, Ted's younger brother, earlier this year.
Yep.
Do you know the story around that song?
No, I don't really, but I think, Les might have been having... I think he'd already tried a relationship at that point in time, and it didn't work out. And
okay.
So I don't... By this time, we weren't all living together, so I can't really say what the story is behind it.
I saw the band a bunch of times, thinking back, 1990 to 92. I know I was just trying to remember. One gig was at the Manly Vale Hotel when it was still standing. I went to that Get Flared concert at Coogee Bay Hotel. Yeah. Several others. What was your involvement with the band during that time period when I think they had Coxie from Rose Tattoo, also Fess from the Radiators, and Mark Tinson in the lineup?
No, I didn't. I wasn't on the road at all during that period of time, and I really had no input into the band. I do mention in the book that after they had that, they had a hiatus where Ted wanted to go to America so that he could try and get recognised as a songwriter. He'd done a deal with Roger Davies, and Roger said, if you come over here, I'll get your songs done, and it didn't kind of happen. And then Ted came back, and after a while, they all sort of thought, we might as well just go back on the road. And I still remember when Herman come around to my place and said, we've got 4 days in Darwin at the opening of the new casino, and it'd be really nice if the 5 of us go just like old times. And I turned it down, and I really wish I hadn't done that, but I had a young family, and I just started a business on my own, and I had to start thinking, because all the way through the 80s I didn't do too well out of the Ted Mulry Gang because, I was picking up a lot of the shortfall in the costs. So, I didn't really want to get stung again.
So you just mentioned the unreleased album in 82. To your knowledge, how much unreleased TMG material is there in the vaults? Well,
I don't know. Well, I don't know that there was that much left over from their earlier recording sessions. I know from the Strutton album they did a song called So Easy, which was written and sung by Herman, but because Herman wouldn't sign a publishing deal with Alberts, they wouldn't let him put the song on the record. So as to whether Herman's got that or whether Alberts kept that, I don't know. Like I said, they did do rough demos of He's Gonna Step on You Again and a couple of other things through the 70s there. And the 16 tracks I have, I think is about it. There's a lot of unreleased solo stuff of Ted's, but it was all incomplete. You know, it was stuff that was just a lot of ideas that were put together. It didn't needed guitar or needed keyboards or needed something, but there is a lot of things like that.
Mate, let's talk about the ARIA Hall of Fame campaign. And I know that you and many others have been pushing to have TMG inducted into the ARIA Hall of Fame via Facebook, and there's also a petition. Am I correct in stating that you are less than a month away from finding out from the ARIA Hall of Fame board if the campaign was successful?
Yes, that's about right. We're about less than a month. I'm not confident myself, because I think if the band was going to be inducted, that one of us would have known by now, because they don't just throw it on you. You know, there's a lot of people being inducted into the ARIA Hall of Fame who shouldn't be there, I shouldn't say shouldn't be there, but haven't had as much impact. I mean, they certainly haven't had a record as big as Jump in My Car, which is a cultural song. You know, everybody remembers it. Everybody knows. Everybody, you know, they can relate to what they were doing. And then last year, of course, when they put in Molly, that went against the criteria anyway. The criteria was set up for artists, the creators of music. So, you know, you don't know where we're going from there. But yeah, I think, you know, mind you, I think that Hush is truly deserving as well. But I only pushed the barrow for the band who I really like, and I pushed that for a while, and you know, I just hope that we do get something out of it.
I blogged about this a couple of years back and argued that TMG meet every criteria
without doubt.
set for being inducted into the Hall of Fame. I mean, 4 decades have passed since the formation, 121 songs, 11 Australian tours, 15 singles, 6 albums, a long-lasting body of work.
Yeah.
TMG have more than paid their dues, and it really is an insult to have excluded them for so long. But I'm not saying anything here which you don't already know, and if listeners want to read all about the campaign, head to facebook.com/tmg.aria.campaign. Mate, we're coming to a close, but I must ask, and I know this is a tough one, are there one or two special moments for you which stand out with TMG? And I guess I'm meaning, having been so close to the band, a special moment during a really big show perhaps that made you feel proud.
You know, every time a show was successful, I felt proud. You know, I was proud just being accepted by them and being a part of it all. You know, like I didn't, you know, in my book I haven't espoused that I was a very good roadie, and I maintain that. You know, I didn't know a lot of things. Now the band, when they started having hit records, they could have dumped me really easy. They could have just patted me on the back and said bye, but they didn't. You know, and even in 1982 when they were doing the 10th anniversary tour and Ted was doing interviews, you know, whether it be in press or whether it be on radio or TV, he was extremely proud of the fact that the band was still the same band and they still had their original roadie. I mean, it meant a real lot to him. And I guess, you know, things like that really made me proud. Mate,
how would you like TMG to be remembered?
You know, I'd like them to be remembered as a band that actually meant something, you know, that did have impact on the industry. You know, I mean, we gave a lot of young bands a start in on our tours, and what people probably don't realise is that all those tours were paid for by us. They weren't paid for by promoters or anybody else. They were paid for by us as a band. We introduced a lot of young roadies into the industry, because we used to take a couple of professional, you know, guys that had been in for a while, and we put a couple of younger guys on. Yeah, you know, I mean, I'd like them. I'd really just like them to be remembered for the fact that they actually did make a difference to a lot of people and to the music.
The book is called "It's a Roadie's Job," written by Ron Clayton. Ron, what is the best way for people to purchase "It's a Roadie's Job"? They
can either look for me on the Ted Mulry Gang Australia page, Facebook page. It's really only available through me either by messaging me off my Facebook page, another page called Here We Are, which is a fan club page, or my personal page, which will be just under Ronald Clayton, but you'd have to make sure you get the one that's in Newcastle.
Before you go, every guest on our show gets to request a song by an Australian band, something which is significant to you. What would you like to hear and why?
I would like to hear Velvet Underground's first and only single, a cover of the Jefferson Airplane song called Somebody to Love. You know, I guess it's a memorable time for me, and it never gets played, and most people don't even know it exists. But because it'd be really difficult for me to pick a Ted Mulry Gang song to play because so many of them I like and have lots of memories to me. But yeah, the original Velvet Underground song would be nice for me.
Ron, it's been wonderful to speak with you. Congratulations once again on publishing your book, a book which contains so many wonderful stories. And it's through your stories, both with TMG and indeed your own life, you've managed to capture a piece of Australia which sadly no longer exists.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for sharing some of these stories with us tonight.
Thank you, Dennis, for giving me the opportunity.